Well, we're in Jeremiah 41 today, and if you were with me yesterday, you know that the chapter ended with a plot against the governor of Israel, Gedaliah. He was appointed governor. He was a Jew and ruling over what was left of Judah and Jerusalem. He was capable as a governor, but a little bit naive about what other people were capable of. So in chapter 40, verses 13 through 16, we see a plot hatching against him. In these verses, verses 1 through 3 particularly, we see the result of that plot. So if you look in the 7th month, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and a bunch of other guys, he was of the royal family, they basically hatched this plot. So this is just a couple months after the fall of Jerusalem. Puts it in the September-October time frame is what's happening here. And notice how we introduce a new character here by the name of Ishmael. He's mentioned several times. He's mentioned in verse 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14, and 15. He's a ringleader here, you'll see, of this murderous plot that was hatched against Gedaliah. See in verse 10, when you get down to there, that when he flees to Ammon. So he seems to be somehow allied with the king of Ammon. Note also as you look in this chapter that Ishmael is identified of the royal family. So I think this is a reference to the Davidic family, and he may be trying to reestablish Davidic rule in Jerusalem and in Judea in place of Zedekiah establishing himself as king. So notice what's happening here. There's an alliance, I'll remind you of that, an alliance between Ammon, Israel, or what's left of it, Judea, and Tyre, to resist the king of Babylon. Egypt gets involved with that because Egypt's the other superpower, and he wants this battle fought not in his own territory, but in Judea. So when Gedaliah comes along after the battle and decides that he is going to pursue a policy of peace with Babylon, it puts Ammon at risk for attack. So this Ishmael character is sent there to replace the appeasing Gedaliah, the peace-loving Gedaliah, with a man who's perhaps going to pursue a policy of opposition to Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. So that's what's happening here. Verse 3 says, Ishmael also struck down all the Judeans. So not just Gedaliah himself, but all the Judeans who were with Gedaliah as Mizpah, and the Chaldean soldiers who happened to be there. So this is really what we would call today a kind of a political decapitation. He killed Gedaliah, he killed the Jews that were supporting Gedaliah's policy, and he also killed the Babylonians or the Chaldeans that were there supporting Gedaliah as well. So this was really a decapitation effort, political decapitation in verses 1 through 3. And then we see this expanding, as it often does with these sorts of things. They kept the operation against Gedaliah and his supporters quiet, and instead they kept quiet, by the way, what I call in this chapter murder. They kept his murder quiet. And before it was widely known, we have a group of people coming to Mizpah in verses 4 through 10. I've called this the murderers mourned. The mourners murdered. Sorry. So verse 5, their garb, the way they're addressed here indicates that they're in mourning. Some think that perhaps they are pilgrims observing the Feast of Booths, which is about this time, also called the Feast of Tabernacles. They may be observing it this time. could be, that's a possibility. They may be on their way to Jerusalem, going through Mizpah, but I'd say if they are going to observe the Feast of Booths, they would have been going straight to Jerusalem. Nevertheless, these pilgrims or these mourners show up. They're invited into the city in verses 6 and 7 where they're ambushed, and almost all of them are killed. Verses 8 to 10, we see some surviving mourners who kind of ransomed their life for a stockpile of food they had. And they became, along with the inhabitants of Mizpah, they became captives of Ishmael. So they're taken by Ishmael. Everybody's herded up. The 10 murderers head to Ammon. So notice here that he seems to be allied with him. Also notice in verse 10 what he's done here is he's taken captive the king's daughters. So they may be high-level hostages that he's taking or intending to take back in Ammon. And then again, keep in mind, as I said earlier, these treaties that seem to get everybody all entangled with one another. But in verses 11 to 18, then the murderers flee. So recall Johanan from chapter 40, verse 13, who had warned Gedaliah of the plot against him. Well, Johanan and the commanders of the remaining forces who had gathered at Mizpah back in chapter 40, they found out what happened, and they're not happy about it. So they go in pursuit of Ishmael and his murderous band, and they run off and they are captured in Gibeon. All his captives then are recovered. They're rescued. 2 of Ishmael's murderous band are killed, so only 8 remain from that raiding party. And in verses 7 to 18, the rest of the survivors were taken by Johanan and his forces to Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem's about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. What they're preparing here, we see in the last part of the chapter, is they're preparing to flee to Egypt. So why would they do this? Well, what's happened is the Gedaliah, who is installed by Nebuchadnezzar through Nebuzaradan, he has been murdered. Some Chaldean soldiers have been killed. Nebuchadnezzar is not going to be happy about this. They're afraid of retaliation. So they are going to get as far away from Babylon as they possibly can, and that is Egypt. So they're getting ready to flee to Egypt as we close this chapter. You know, when we think about applications today, sometimes it's hard to understand what's happening to Israel and its relevance to the church. But let me suggest one thing that really strikes me as I go through this chapter is that, you know who's not mentioned in this chapter, and I think his absence is conspicuous, is Jeremiah. Now, I think Jeremiah is probably among those people that were taken from Gibeah by Ishmael toward Ammon, and that he had been among those who were rescued and taken to Bethlehem. So I think he's among them, but he's never mentioned in this chapter. And it reminds me of the kind of the aftermath of sin. You know, Jerusalem and Judea are suffering from the aftermath of sin. And in that situation, people are just looking for solutions. They're trying to be very pragmatic and looking for solutions when there's chaos and aftermath that comes with the aftermath of sin. And I wonder how it might have turned out for them differently, Gedaliah particularly, if he had started out by recommitting themselves to observance of the Deuteronomic law. If things would have maybe turned out better if the voice of God through Jeremiah had been heard in this chapter, rather than men like Ishmael and Johanan and Gedaliah trying to work things out on their own. I think that same thing is true to today. Sometimes we fall into sin. Sometimes we deliberately embrace sin. and then fall back and slide back into sin. Wonder what heartache and turmoil we might avoid if, rather than trying to work out our own problems on our own, figure a solution, try to solve the problems that our sin causes, if instead we start out with a fleeing to God, and a fleeing to God at His Word. How different our lives might be, how quickly our problems may dissipate, should we commit ourselves and recommit ourselves to returning to the Lord and His Word. So think about that, brothers and sisters. I don't know what spiritual condition some of you might be in, but if you are reaping the results of maybe some temporary backsliding, today is the day to turn that around, and the first step is to recommit yourself to the Word of God. God bless you, brothers and sisters, and we'll be tomorrow, look at my schedule here, finishing up the week in Jeremiah chapter 42. So God bless you, and we'll talk to you tomorrow from Jeremiah 42.